Hello, everyone, and welcome to the special edition of Listening to America. I'm Clay Jenkinson, and across from me is Louis Masur, the author of a new book on Thomas Jefferson and James Madison and the amazing 1791 journey they made up into the heart of New England. So welcome, sir.
Great to be with you, Clay. Thank you.
So how did you come to write this book?
Well, one of the things that I work on, I'm an American cultural and political historian, and I like to look for moments, vignettes, and sort of unpack them, explode them. My sort of approach to the writing of history in the world in the grain of sand. I wrote a book about a year called 1831, Year of Eclipse. I've written a book about a photograph. And at some point, I came across the fact that these two took this trip together. And it intrigued me, and I began to research it and look into it and decided there was a nice little story here to be told about these two amazing friends and founding fathers taking this 6-week journey together up through New York and Vermont and Connecticut and Massachusetts and back down through Long Island.
It's an amazing little episode in the life of Thomas Jefferson, particularly, but I want to set the scene. So this is the 1790s. Now the new government of the United States is in place. George Washington is the president of the United States. Jefferson has come back from France, where he spent 5 years. He was, in fact, expecting to return to France, and he discovers that he's been named Secretary of State. So, of course, he accepts that, moves to New York City, meets Colonel Hamilton, who had been named Secretary of the Treasury. He was also Washington's aide-de-camp during the war and one of the most brilliant revolutionaries, let's call it. And so even though the founding fathers did not expect there to be political parties, did not want there to be political parties, Washington and Hamilton and John Adams in one direction, they're called the Federalists, and the others move in the other direction. That would be Thomas Paine and James Madison and Thomas Jefferson and so on. Is that a fair, quick background?
Yeah, it's a terrific background. And what's key, I think, in part about understanding this journey is it occurs at precisely the moment that this political turmoil, even agony, has just sort of broken and emerged. You know, they leave on May 21st. Well, only a year earlier, Jefferson, Madison, and Hamilton had that famous meeting where they strike a deal to get Hamilton's fiscal plans passed in return for the Residence Act, moving the capital to the banks of the Potomac. And Jefferson in particular at this moment is in the throes of all kinds of political battles. Not only with Hamilton, there's been a huge contretemps because he wrote an endorsement for Tom Paine, who you mentioned, Rights of Man, and he meant it to be private. It wasn't. It ends up being in the dedication of the book signed by the Secretary of State, and the endorsement condemned the heresies of the day. So Adams is up in arms. All the gossip is about this. And so I think part of, you know, one of the questions that we don't have a firm answer to is why did they take this trip? Why are they going off together? I think one of the reasons is just simply to escape this cauldron of political intensity and enmity that had emerged really in many ways only over the previous 12 to 18 months.
Yeah, that's really well said. Thank you. So we have this moment when the dream of a post-revolutionary period of harmony in which will be a republic in an unprecedented sense, and that people will just do the rational thing and the right thing and put their self-interest behind them and so on. That's already shattering now, and we're emerging in as yet another culture that has a political system and factions.
That's right.
The founding fathers didn't like the idea of faction. They were struggling to absorb the emergence of a political system. And I think there was a lot of disappointment. I think both sides felt like they represented the nation and the other side was somehow distorting it. So
yes,
I'm sure you hear some echoes of our own situation there.
Sure. Jefferson famously said, if I cannot go to heaven but with party, I shall not go there at all. And yet, of course, he is part of the group at the heart of creating the most extreme partisanship known at that time to the country, including opposing political newspapers. In fact, one of the things they do in New York before taking off on their trip is to meet with Philip Freneau to discuss starting a Democratic Republican newspaper. to oppose the Federalist newspaper. So already we have really the institutionalization of a kind of political opposition taking place.
It's really one of the most fascinating periods of the life of Thomas Jefferson, and I want to hear so much more about it. But I want to sort of get ahead of ourselves a little bit, Louis, if I can. Is it fair to say that Jefferson did not prove to be a wholly loyal Secretary of State to the Washington administration?
It depends on what you mean by loyal, right? He had his agenda. But as you know, Hamilton has his agenda as well. A lot of the battles that take place, I think, have to do with appealing to Washington to take sides with one over the other. In fact, earlier you sort of characterized Washington as a Federalist. We might debate that a little bit to the extent that Washington may be the only one who was neither Federalist nor Republican, but as someone once said, was truly an American. But of course, he disappoints Jefferson by supporting Hamilton. And supporting Hamilton's policies, particularly the Bank of the United States. So even though they're fellow Virginians, I think Jefferson certainly has his own vision. And as you know, his vision is much more Francophile than it is Anglophile. And so that too is part of the package.
It's early on. We're in the first administration under the new Constitution of the United States. And I think a lot of these players are kind of caught off guard by the emergence of party struggle, and now they have to try to figure out how they're going to manage it. And I think that, in a sense, is the background to this journey.
That's right. And in fact, Clay, again, coming back to this question of what is this journey about? Why are they taking this journey? I mean, why are these two leaders of this opposition party, if you will, traveling to an area that is decidedly Federalist? There's lots of speculation that part of it is a sort of effort to sort of win over or change the minds of people up in New York and Connecticut and Massachusetts. They do also want to see Vermont. Vermont is a newly admitted state, and Vermont may be a state in the Democratic Republican sort of file. I don't think there's truth to that. I mean, there's a lot of speculation about it. I don't think that's the reason why they go on this trip. But once they're on the trip, clearly politics is going to come up. They dine with Philip Schuyler in Albany, Alexander Hamilton's father-in-law. They meet with the governor of Vermont. You cannot have these two men at this moment in American history taking this trip and having it just be for, and here's the phrase that Madison used. It's a wonderful phrase. When he wrote to Jefferson, he said that they were taking the trip for health, recreation, and curiosity. Health, recreation, and curiosity. And he said, with that in mind, we can never be out of our way. And to be sure, most of the journey was devoted to those issues, not to political issues.
How long were they on this journey?
6 weeks. They left on May 21st. They returned on June 16th. They covered 920 miles.
And what was their vehicle of conveyance through all of that territory?
They had what at the time were called phaetons. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. These sort of carriages with horses, and they also rode horseback. We know that James Hemings accompanied Jefferson. And as is often the case in the historical record, that's all we know. There are some letters. Jefferson kept a journal for part of the trip. There is no additional reference to Hemings, except for the fact that we know that he accompanied them, that Jefferson sent Hemings ahead with the horses when they first left New York to go up to Albany, so that the horses were awaiting them when they got off the ship. But the story is therefore primarily a story just about the two of them and the things they encounter, the things they look at, the sort of things that interest them. And here, and you well know this, is what's so exciting is to see Jefferson Madison as something other than the political figures for which we venerate and know them, right? They were Enlightenment men. And Jefferson in particular, they were fascinated by the natural landscape. They were fascinated by everything possible, and that's what really emerges in lots of ways from this trip.
And that's excellent. The usual way of seeing this is that Jefferson and Madison, who were neighbors effectively about 35 miles apart in Virginia, had met in the 1770s, and then they cooperated on the Virginia Statute for Religious Liberty. And so they were already these friends, exchanging letters about crops and about building projects and so on. And so to say that they forged their friendship as late as 1791 got my attention. So I know you've got a reason for saying that.
Fair enough. Fair enough. You know, it was hard to find the right verb. I truly believe that the expedition that they take together, the road trip, the founding fathers' road trip that they take together in 1791, further cements, intensifies. Those perhaps are better verbs than simply forge, but to the extent that it's there, but now it's made into cast iron. And my evidence for that, Clay, is this. In the 1820s, they both look back on this trip. Madison writes a letter in which he says that journey in 1791 made us immediate companions. That's his phrase, immediate companions. And Jefferson has occasion to write his granddaughter about the trip and what it meant to them. And so, yes, you're absolutely right. I mean, they meet in 1776. They work together in the Virginia Assembly. They become fast friends. There's no question about that. They bond over books. They take long walks together in Philadelphia. Jefferson is nudging Madison to, as he is everyone, to move to Monticello area. He even becomes his sort of real estate agent. He's sending him, in effect, listings of available property, and Madison sort of demurs. So absolutely, I'm not saying that this is the start of that friendship, but something happens. Some kind of alchemy takes place, I think, during those 6 weeks on the road together that just further intensifies and deepens what is clearly the most important political friendship in American history.
Well, that's exactly what I wanted you to say. That was so well said. I'm talking with Louis Masur. This is such an interesting book, A Journey North, Jefferson, Madison, and the Forging of Friendship. We'll take a quick break. When we come back, I want to ask you about this somewhat odd pairing, Jefferson and James Madison. Well, stay tuned, everyone. We'll be back in just a moment. Welcome back to this special edition of Listening to America. Louis Masur at Rutgers. So Louis, Jefferson and Madison go on this extraordinary journey, more than a month, 6 weeks, into New England, which is a really long distance from Albemarle County, Virginia, not just in terms of mileage, but conceptually. It's a break. The government's on a break. Jefferson and Madison get in this carriage, this phaeton. They have luggage. There's at least one black enslaved man with them. They have a kind of a loose itinerary. Tell me about these two men, because yes, they're best friends, if we can use that term, but they're also very different human beings. Jefferson is tall. He is imaginative, creative, visionary, somewhat radical. He's a little dreamy, a little otherworldly in the way that he talks about the possibilities of America. And Madison is like Sancho Panza. He's short, he's diminutive, he's shy, he wears black, he has a kind of introverted style. He's always nervous, but he's a deep, deep student of the humanities, of history and law and literature and politics, and in many respects a more penetrating and systematic thinker than the great man next to him. But there is a little odd couple feeling about this friendship to me. Talk about that.
Yeah, well, you described it perfectly well. In addition, I would add that Jefferson is 8 years older. So there's a certain element of the sort of older brother element, I think, in their relationship. Jefferson's always introducing Madison to things. He's telling Madison, get a thermometer and keep track of the temperature.
Have you read the pedometer letter where
yes,
because I'm sending you this pedometer, I have 3.5 pages of instruction of how you attach it to your breeches.
Yes, exactly. So there's a certain element of that, I think, in their relationship. Jefferson loved to travel. Madison did not like to travel. I mean, this is the longest journey that Madison ever takes. Part of it is his constitution, bilious fevers and nervousness and attacks of one kind of another.
Maybe
Of course,
some epilepsy. We're not sure, but
we're not sure, right? Of course, Jefferson suffered from migraines terribly and had hopes that this trip would relieve those migraines. But I want to be careful not to also give Madison credit for, on his own terms, being interested in the same kind of scientific, natural history, Enlightenment ideas that Jefferson is interested in. He's not just doing it because Jefferson is the sort of expert on this. In his journal, he's describing, Madison is, the landscape. He's describing the trees. After the journey, they both engage. So one of the ostensible purposes of the journey is there's something called the Hessian Fly that has destroyed wheat crops throughout the North, starting in Long Island. And before leaving, at a meeting of the American Philosophical Society, Jefferson created a series of queries that he wanted to investigate and ask about the origins and depredations of the Hessian Fly along his journey. In fact, there's sort of four, if you will, sets of notes in Jefferson's hand from the journey. One of them is literally called Notes on the Hessian Fly. We forget often, to our peril, that these founders were farmers and they loved agriculture. Washington called it his favorite amusement. And so the idea that wheat crops were being destroyed and the anxiety that the Hessian fly would ultimately be making its way to Virginia motivates part of the scientific element of the trip for Jefferson. He becomes, in effect, an entomologist. So when they return, they actually get larvae of Hessian flies, both of them do, and investigate them and look at them and pick them apart. So again, this is one of those topics, Clay, that flies under the radar because we're, not inappropriately interested in the politics of these men, but it is in some ways just as important because the post-revolutionary economy depended upon wheat and wheat exports, and this fly was devastating them. And so along the journey, both of them engage in these interrogatories about the fly.
That's so interesting. Quickly, one quick question. Is it true that the Hessian fly came over with Hessian mercenaries and because we had no immunity to it, it devastated American wheat?
It is absolutely not true. It's one of the great pieces of propaganda that I trace in the book, the origins of that. They called it that as a way of denouncing the Hessian soldiers who the British brought along to fight in the Revolution. In fact, it is of domestic origins, but nobody knew that at the time. And so what you believe versus what you know, of course, are two different things.
I guess that's like the Chinese epidemic, right? We do that. The Spanish flu, we tend to find a stooge, a vilified figure that we can attach.
That's right.
Disease or an epidemic to.
Right. And nobody wanted to believe it was of domestic origins, because then what does that say about this, this new nation and the disease, literally and metaphorically, that might be coursing through it?
And also, there's a politics here too. However much we in the end have to condemn Jefferson and Madison as lifelong slaveholders and so on, the fact is that Jefferson was profoundly uneasy as a holder of human beings, and Madison too in his own way. And Jefferson knew that tobacco, as a very labor-intensive crop and also a crop that exhausts the soil, was not healthy for America in any way, and wanted to replace the tobacco economy, if we could, with something like wheat, because wheat is something you can ingest. Tobacco has no nutritional value, and so it's cursed in all sorts of ways. It requires slave labor, it requires intensive labor, it's a noxious weed, it doesn't feed a single human being, and it exhausts the soil, and yet amazingly profitable. So everyone's looking for a wheat alternative. Washington himself was experimenting in wheat in some really interesting ways. And so when they go looking for the answer to the Hessian fly, this could stall out any attempts to diversify America's monoculture.
That's absolutely right. And, financially, at one point, Britain refuses to accept imports of wheat from America, claiming that the Hessian fly is in the rubble. And so the politics and the natural history combine in important kinds of ways. And there's no doubt that the fly was devastating. And part of what I trace are the attempts of people like Benjamin Rush and others to sort of figure out alternatives to wheat cultivation, how to destroy the fly. I mean, it still exists today, the Hessian fly. It's just we have discovered ways of managing it. It's interesting that you should mention the shift away from tobacco, in part connected to the labor of the enslaved. Something else, Clay, that they do on this trip is they write extensively about the sugar maple tree. So they get to Vermont, and both of them note sugar maples. And part of that as well is a movement taking place at that moment to get away from importing cane sugar made by slaves in the islands to the production of domestic sugar through use of the sugar maple tree. And there's experiment after experiment after experiment in doing this. You know this. I know you've been to Monticello many times. One of the things that Jefferson laments is his inability to ever get sugar maple trees to grow at Monticello. He buys up all the sugar maple trees he can. They stop on their way back at a famous nursery called Prince's Nursery. And the first thing he says is, "Send me all your sugar maples." And he has this correspondence with the estate about, are they growing? How are they doing? And they can never, ever, ever get them to grow. But part of that, too, like the shift from tobacco to wheat, is this attempt to move away from cane sugar to domestic production of sugar.
That's fantastic. And, sugar was produced in the Caribbean, places like Haiti and Cuba, but also in the extreme South, in places like Florida and Louisiana and the Gulf Coast. And so, that's axiomatic of the worst kind of American slavery, that to be a slave on a sugar plantation was essentially a death sentence.
That's correct.
So you can understand why from the point of view of humanity only, forget slavery for a moment, but just humanity, Jefferson would want to domesticate our sugar industry to the extent that we could.
That's right. And what destroys it is the creation of cane sugar plantations in Louisiana in the early 19th century. So the movement to domestic production of sugar sort of falls apart. But it's a moment in the 1790s where there's meetings after meeting, there are petitions being written, there are boycott campaigns against imported cane sugar. The whole thing is taking place. And so that also is a critical part of this journey. Turns out to be a critical part of this journey. It's not why they went, but once they're there and they see these sugar maple trees, it connects to these other interests that are going on at the time.
It's so intriguing. The agenda of this journey was much larger than a simple summer vacation, and it was much larger than the old allegation that they were just stirring up anti-federalist feeling in New England. So Louis, let me ask you this question about all of that. You said that Jefferson wrote these notes on the Hessian fly. Sounds like an Enlightenment report to the American Philosophical Society. I just have this lovely idea of the two of them trying to find fly larvae. If you gave me $500 and said, go find fly larvae, I'd have a really hard time doing it. So these, as you say, are farmers. They know what they're doing out there in the fields of America. So there were three other note sets that Jefferson took. Tell us what they were.
Yes. So he kept a journal for part of the trip. The most typically Jefferson thing that he did was he kept a list of lodgings where he stayed, miles traveled, and he rated the lodgings based on whether they were poor, middling, or good.
So early Yelp.
Yeah, I include a reproduction of that in the book. It's just wonderful, and it's just typically Jeffersonian, right? These lists, keep track.
Queries, questionnaires, all these things were the heart of the Enlightenment.
That's right.
Always making a grid for somebody.
Grids and lists. And we're going to come back to lists, I hope, in a minute, because there's one other really critical part of this journey that I'd like to talk with you about, particularly because of the journey that you're now embarking on, because as you will see, these overlap. But the other thing that Jefferson does is he writes a couple of letters. He writes a letter to George Washington reporting on the trip. He writes 2 letters to his daughters, and that gets very, very interesting, including he writes one letter on birch bark. But what he does first is he composes the letter and then transfers it to birch bark because, as he would tell Lewis and Clark as well, and that's part of the connection here, among other things, birch bark is sturdier, it would last longer. So 2 of the letters that he writes during the journey are to his daughters, and they're on birch bark.
I know that, and I know the Lewis and Clark connection. We'll come back to that, but help me think about this. They're literally going up to a birch tree and tearing off a fool's cap-sized piece of bark.
That's right.
That's round. That's rough. That's thick. How's this paper?
You probably know better than I do how they prepare it to be able to write on it. I'm not sure the answer to that, but they had experience doing it, and he did it. Probably moisten it, wet it, dry it out, and then you have something.
Yeah, what a hassle, I guess, is the answer. And Jefferson, as you know, writes this letter to his daughter, extolling birch bark.
That's right.
Paper is going to be so useful. It's less perishable.
Right.
We're going to try this. He's really excited about the possibility of this paper. So we may as well tell the Lewis and Clark story. So in his famous instructions to Lewis of June 1803, he brings it up, doesn't he?
Yes, he does. He suggests that would be a useful way to sort of keep notes of the journey, and they would be less perishable.
If you can do it. And
That's
then
right.
He says when you're at leisure, just copy out all your journals from time to time so that we don't lose any to accidents or whatever. And, try the birch bark, the paper of the birch bark. That'll really help preserve these records. Back to this just for one more question about this. I've read some fairly recent negative accounts of Jefferson and Native Americans, that he was condescending, patronizing in his speeches, that he really was just a kinder, gentler version of what would be Andrew Jackson, that he was going to force natives out of the way, and if necessary, could even use the word extermination from time to time. The famous letter to William Henry Harrison, which he said basically and give a lot of credit in the trading shops to the leaders and get them deeply in debt. And then when they can't pay their debt, maybe they'll just lop off Ohio for us or Indiana. I mean, there's a lot of anti-Jefferson or really critical commentary on Jefferson and Native Americans. And I subscribe to some parts of that, of course. But it's also said in those books that he never really saw Indians as Indians, that he had a kind of a Rousseauian idea of Native Americans, that they were like Demosthenes in buckskins, and that they lived in this perfect harmony internally and had no written constitutions, no penal colonies, that sort of trope. And Jefferson was right in there, that Native Americans were us before civilization. And we had a lot to learn about us before civilization by looking at people in a natural state. First of all, I think you agree with that.
What I agree with completely is that there are tensions. And the problem that we often have is we want to characterize Jefferson and other figures in history as one way or the other. It's hard for us intellectually sometimes to accept the paradoxes and the conundrums that exist. So yes, Jefferson can simultaneously say Native Americans are another edition of man, and in Notes on the State of Virginia, praise them in so many different ways, and yet at the same time become the person to advance the policies that would try and compel Native Americans to abandon their life of fishing and hunting and gathering to become more domesticated along the lines of which Americans thought they should live, and if not, take their lands and exterminate them. It's hard for us to hold those two things in our heads at the same time, but that problem is ours, not Jefferson's. And so I agree with your characterization completely. It's not either or, it's both and.
But so just to close this section, we need to take another break. I'm talking with Louis Masur, this extraordinary account of Jefferson and Madison's 1791 botanizing tour, as they called it, into New England. But before we take a break, just one more question about that. So, said by some of the critics that Jefferson never really saw an Indian community intact, that he really was in his kind of Virgilian, Homeric dreaminess about this and never really met Indians except when they came to the White House, and that was a highly ceremonial and artificial circumstance. And you're saying in this book that he goes to this village.
That's correct.
This is not a state of nature. These are people living on a reservation, but it's closer than it would be today, right?
Yes, absolutely. You know, there are a few of them still that speak the language, but that makes him all the more intrigued to meet with them and to learn from them and to discover something about their language. I mean, he doesn't want to change them. He wants to learn from them. And, that is an incredible ethnographic moment that captures Jefferson's real interest in Indians, you know, apart from, as you know, president, policies that are going to be introduced that are going to have devastating consequences for tribes across the Mississippi.
Yeah, we need to take another break. I'm having a great time here talking with Louis Masur about his new book, A Journey North, Jefferson, Madison, and the Forging of a Friendship. We'll be back in just a moment. Welcome back to this really interesting edition of Listening to America. I'm talking with Louis Masur, the author of A Journey North, about Madison and Jefferson in 1791. So just one last word about the vocabularies, because you know this story. This is the 18th century, so nobody can express anger very well. They have to always code their anger in some sort of Ciceronian language. But when Jefferson loses those vocabularies, or rather when they're vandalized, his friend Meriwether Lewis, his protege, sent him a really stern letter. I love this letter. Can't say, I'm really angry at you, Mr. Jefferson. How could you let this happen? He can't write that sentence. He's Meriwether Lewis, and the recipient is Thomas Jefferson. But he writes this letter, and you can just feel the very carefully coded rage. He says, isn't it interesting, Mr. Jefferson, that these documents which cross the continent of the United States through raging rivers and howling deserts, now when they are so close to, isn't it interesting that they should perish in this way? And you can feel the edge there, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Interesting is a fascinating euphemism for the total disappointment and rage. Jefferson's letter to Benjamin Smith Barton, eminent physician and naturalist, says, an irreparable misfortune has deprived me of them. I have now been 30 years availing myself of every possible opportunity of procuring Indian vocabularies to the same set of words. My opportunities were better than will ever occur again. I collected about 50, digested most of them, but not having yet digested Captain Lewis's collection, nor having leisure then to do it, I put it off till I should return home. And it's that procrastination that bites at him as much as anything. And then he goes ahead and describes what had happened. The whole of the vocabularies, the leaves floated ashore, were found in the mud, but these were very few and so defaced by the mud and water that no general use can ever be made of them.
And of course, he doesn't say what he also is thinking, and this can never be repeated.
That's correct.
Others may go do some of this. They will surely, but what I can't, I'm never again going to be able to do this. Lewis can never again do this. And Lewis, you just want to say two things. First of all, where's a copying machine when you really need one? Come on. And secondly, why didn't you, Mr. Jefferson? As you made a copy of everything. You copied every letter you ever wrote.
Right.
Why didn't you, either yourself or through an amanuensis, sit down and get a fair copy of these vocabularies so that there was, he'd been browbeating Lewis about repeating your journals and copying them out at leisure times and use birch bark. So Jefferson himself fails to copy things that are, even if there hadn't been vandals, this is a very dicey way to move things.
Yeah. Yeah. No, you're absolutely right. And I think he punished himself over it. You could feel the despair. And, one of the side stories here is the Lewis vocabularies are still missing, that some of those never got to Jefferson, so they didn't perish in that trunk. They went to Nicholas Biddle, who was writing one of the first biographies. You know the details of this probably better than I do. And then Smith Barton apparently had them. And then to this day, no one knows.
Barton died without doing his work for the projected 3-volume account of all of this.
That's right.
So one last thing, and then I want to move on, but because there's just so much more to talk about here. But in his 250-word printed grid of vocabulary for Lewis and others, under M, there's the word mammoth.
Yes.
Jefferson was not quite ready to accept the idea of the extinction of any species.
That's right.
He saw it coming. He kind of he understood the chain of being. That trope is probably going to break down a little bit here. There are more species than we thought, and there's more extinction. And certainly these giant quadrupeds, these early elephants are probably gone forever. But it pains him. It pains him to think of extinction, and so he told Lewis,
"That's right.
Grid, if you have a minute, and you're amongst the Shoshone or the Nez Perce, say, what's the word for mammoth, and see what they say."
Yeah, and to a certain extent, also, he's still litigating or relitigating the arguments of Buffon about size in America, right? And about American nature and culture not being inferior to European civilization. That's also where the mammoth comes in as part of his desire to refute those ideas.
So you have here the 6'2.5" man who is by all counts sort of bony and angular, and a little bit aloof as a human being. He has a certain detachment from others. He protects his privacy. And then you have Madison, who's 5'2", I think. Diminutive fellow, always sick, or maybe thinking he's sick.
Yeah. Weighs 100 pounds.
So you have, if there's a certain kind of a Mutt and Jeff feel to this, 6'3" versus 5'2" is a lot of distance.
Right.
And Jefferson is given to what I call the Jefferson music. He's like, there's nothing is more certainly written in the book of fate, that language that he uses when he's dreaming of utopia. And Madison is much more, we want to hammer this out. We want to make sure we're saying the right thing here. We don't want to overstate. We don't want to touch off a debate that we don't want to get ourselves into. And we don't want to say what's not even totally true. Let's bring this down a little. And what's amazing to me in this friendship is two things. One is that Madison must have been exasperated by Thomas Jefferson a lot of the time in their long friendship, because Jefferson is always floating up some crazy trial balloon, the Kentucky resolutions or something else, and Madison has to talk him off the ledge. And he must be going to his lovely wife, Dolly Madison, and saying, he's a genius, but he's a problem. He's always doing something like this. And so the exasperation level for Madison must have been fairly high at certain times, and yet he never broke with Jefferson. He loved Jefferson right up to the end, and in fact defended Jefferson's reputation for the remaining years of Madison's life. So there's that element.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think between the two of them, Jefferson was the agitator, let's say, and Madison was the sort of cooler heads prevail. But Jefferson was never so far out on a limb that Madison couldn't see parts of what he was saying, even come over more to Jefferson's side and pull Jefferson back. Look at their famous correspondence about the Bill of Rights and the necessity of a Bill of Rights. I mean, Jefferson's in France, reads the Constitution, demands, insists, beautiful, eloquent letters. Madison at first wasn't so sure. Is a Bill of Rights really necessary? If we have a Bill of Rights, what if there are certain rights that we can't name? I mean, Hamilton famously in the Federalist Papers argued against a Bill of Rights. But where does Madison move? He moves in Jefferson's direction. And there are other times where I think he brings Jefferson sort of back down to earth a little bit. they shared so much more, not only politically, but just sort of constitutionally, intellectually. In retirement, the University of Virginia is Jefferson's baby. Madison is right there with him through all of it. That belief in education, the importance of education, their faith in education. And of course, as you noted, in his sort of valedictory letter, he knows he's dying. He knows he hasn't got long to live. He closes one of his last letters by saying to Madison, "Take care of me when dead.
I'm going to need your help because there's going to be an anti-Jefferson reaction."
That's right.
You're going to have to not only protect me, but protect our joint vision of this country against those who think finally Jefferson's off the table. We can move to the center again.
And Madison takes that to the upteenth degree. Not only does he, when the governor of Virginia says Jefferson would have opposed protective tariffs, Madison jumps right in and says, no, you have no idea of what Jefferson's views on protective tariffs are. But it goes even further. I love this detail. When a writer sent Madison a copy of his biography of Jefferson, Madison offered a correction. Jefferson's hair was not red, but between yellow and red. It's that level of detail. So talk about taking care of your friend when dead and understanding history and memory and what that is going to mean. Madison fulfills those responsibilities. When Madison replied to Jefferson's letter, he said, "You cannot look back to the long period of our private friendship and political harmony with more affecting recollections than I do. If they are a source of pleasure to you, what ought they not be to me? Wishing and hoping that you may yet live to increase the debt our country owes you, I offer you the fullest return of affectionate assurances." They've been friends for 50 years. They've served the country. They have served one another. They know time is running short. And here they are at these last meetings. They meet for the last time at a Board of Overseers meeting for the University of Virginia. And they exchange letters. And perhaps for me, the absolute most poignant statement about this relationship that ties directly to this journey that they took in 1791. In his will, Jefferson bequeaths Madison his walking stick.
That's so good. That's like the relic from the journey.
There it is.
Relic from the 1791 journey. I just say to I love this conversation. So yes, the friendship, and I get that. I just want to get us onto the trip for a minute, if I can.
Sure.
Because we've been talking about Hessian flies and this and that.
Yeah, but
all
that's
part
great.
of it. But so Jefferson takes these incredibly detailed notes about where they stayed. If you and I were going on this journey, we would have a vehicle that was under our control and required nobody else to move us forward. One of us would drive. We would have Google Maps to determine where we wanted to go, or old style physical maps, and we would be poring over them and saying, should we take this road? Should we go there? Do we want to go to Ticonderoga? What are the lakes we want to see? We would have that journey. We also, if we wanted, would be able to book rooms ahead at high quality, reputable motels all over the world. We would know that we could get food anytime, anywhere, because there are going to be restaurants every 5 minutes if you're driving, every 15 certainly. So it's hard for us to imagine what this had to have been like. So talk about what this had to have been like.
It's arduous, I think, from our point of view, but and the roads were not great, but they traveled roads that some of them had traveled before. Jefferson had been up through parts of this area previously. For example, they met with people who had contacts to advise them where to go and how to go. Lake George was very, very important to their journey. So they get to Lake George. They travel across it. They traveled Lake Champlain as well. In Vermont, they can't travel on a Sunday because of the Sabbath. There's a provision against traveling on the Sabbath. They actually end up being taken to the First Congregational Church. This is a hysterical moment in some ways, given the deist Jefferson, that leads to a whole discussion about religion and some speculation about what Jefferson might have thought of the minister's sermon that day. There's a certain amount of accident that's involved, as in any travel is, fortune, happening upon a falls that they didn't expect to see, hearing that there was a nail manufactory. This is also very important, as you know, to Jefferson Monticello. He goes to visit and ultimately institutes that at Monticello. By all accounts, remain well enough and vigorous enough. They hunt, believe it or not.
They shoot animals?
They shoot some squirrel, red squirrel that Jefferson writes about. They kill a couple of snakes. They also, and this to me is really interesting, they visit Saratoga and the battlefield. They are historians as well as actors in the history. And this is 1791. It's not long after 1777 and those battles. And this is among those first attempts to memorialize these sites and to visit these sites and to recognize these sites. So both that and the Battle of Bennington are important to the stories that they tell and that they record in their journals. The same way, Clay, as when we go out touring, we want to see the sites where things happened. We want to be part of that history. And that's what they're doing. They're going to Saratoga. They're going to Bennington. They're learning about those battles that at that point was only, a little over a decade old, but are still part of the past.
Well, let's just sort of find them somewhere on the trail. So let's put them in Connecticut or something. So if they don't know where they're going exactly, then James Hemings goes ahead and Jefferson will say, find an inn, book these rooms, tell them we're going to need such and such for the horses, maybe 2 nights here. If you can't find an inn, then maybe there's a farm we can stay overnight at and so on. They had to be thinking about this all the time. So talk about that.
It's not as complicated in some ways as it sounds, particularly in those areas, so they know Springfield, so they'll go to Springfield, and there are famous inns in Springfield. In fact, they stay at a famous anti-Federalist inn in Springfield. They cross the river to do what? To look at the trees. There's a great, in fact, Jefferson laments that he didn't take more samples of leaves. And he tells Madison, Madison was thinking of heading up to Boston after this trip was over. He never makes the trip. But he writes after the trip a letter to Madison saying, don't forget, if you do, take more samples of the trees. So then from Springfield, they're going to head down to New Haven. Jefferson has been there before. Previously, he dined with Ezra Stiles, who said that some wonderful things about Jefferson. They know they want to get back through Long Island because they want to, that's where the Hessian Fly originates. So, okay, fine. We're going to go now from New Haven to Middleton. That's where we're going to get the ferry. That's going to take us across to Long Island. It's an overnight ferry. It's probably the longest sea journey that Madison ever took. I only imagine him absolutely terrified.
And sick to his stomach, too.
Yeah, exactly. And then once they're on Long Island, they're just going to make their way through back to Brooklyn.
So Louis, you're saying this journey wasn't as remote and rugged as one might imagine.
That's correct. There's a pretty good sense. You go to Albany, you go to Saratoga, you go to, to Bennington. I mean, they're not exploring the wilderness per se, but they are involved in the happenstance of travel, good meals, bad meals, accidents on the road, but trying their best to fulfill Madison's dictum of health, recreation, and curiosity. They come back and they write letters saying that the trip accomplished for them what they wanted it to accomplish. For a moment, at least, they both feel vigorous and well. They feel more relaxed, and they certainly have satisfied the injunction of curiosity.
I want you just to, because you're such a good storyteller, and you're cautiously willing to speculate. What are the conversations these two guys are having? Do they talk about life? Do they talk about loss? Try to imagine the intellectual discourse of these two men.
I think that the discourse primarily is about the things that they're experiencing and seeing.
What they're seeing. They're
talking about the Hessian fly. They're talking about the sugar maple tree. I'm not so sure they're going to engage in much of a conversation about Prince Taylor. All right, this free black farmer who they encounter.
That's kind of taboo zone now, isn't it?
I believe so, right? I think those conversations are different. I'm sure they're talking about politics. They have dinner in Albany with Philip Schuyler. There may be some talk, about family and some personal matters, but primarily I think they're just, spending long, full days traveling, keeping their eyes open, investigating, learning, experiencing, and trying to do what all journeys provide. They're momentary journeys of escape and rejuvenation and refreshment that hopefully allow us to then go back into our day-to-day lives with that much more vigor and energy.
A perfect place to end here. Thank you. I recommend this book, A Journey North, Jefferson, Madison, and the Forging of the Friendship. Louis Masur. We'll see you all next week for another important edition of Listening to America.